So in this section, we are going to be talking about subnet. A subnet is another component of the virtual private cloud, VPC. So with the help of a subnet now, we can divide a large network or a large VPC into a smaller network called subnet. Remember now that we've allowed, with the help of internet gateway, you now allow people from the internet to come into your VPC. So because now you make your VPC accessible to the public, then you also expose yourself to the bad guys out there, like the hackers. They always come, or they always pretend to have good intention, but immediately they come into your network, then you see their bad intention. So you still want people to be able to connect to your network, but you don't want to give them access to everything. You only want to give them access to what they should get or what they need. So because of this, you might divide this network into two or multiple. You might call the part that people have access to the public subnet, while the access or the one that you don't want people to have access to as the private subnet. Just look at this like your house. If you are inviting people to your house, maybe you are throwing a party in your house, you might only want access for people. Maybe the only place you want people to be able to access is your living room, and you are not giving access to your bedroom. So this public subnet might be the living room, while this private subnet is your bedroom. So any resources that you want the people that you grant access to, any resources that you want them to have or have access to, you put it in the public subnet. For example, your web server. You want people to be able to view your website so that they know what you are doing. You want people to be able to buy something on your website so that they can pay money. Then you can put that in the public website. Why those other resources that you don't want people to have access to, like your data, like your files, folders, your secret documents, then you put all those in the private network. So now we have a smaller network inside a giant network. Just like the VPC, when you create a, sorry, let me go back one steps. When you create a VPC, by default, it is private. When you create, listen to this, when you create a VPC, by default, it is private. It does not have any access to the internet, or it cannot connect to any other thing. So if you want it to be able to connect to the internet or to your on-prem site or to your administrator to be able to access to it, then you have to connect it to the internet so that they can have access to it. And by doing so, you have to attach an internet gateway. If you create a subnet inside a VPC, that subnet by default is automatically private, even if you already have an internet gateway attached. Once you create a subnet, the subnet is private. Nobody can connect to it after from on-prem or anywhere. But these two subnets that you have in your VPC, they can connect to each other without internet. Resources here, our web server can connect to our database because they are in the same VPC. But any other resources cannot connect, even if you already have an internet gateway attached. Your VPC, your subnet, if you want to be able, or if you want people to be able to connect to it from the outside, or you want this subnet to be able to connect to this subnet too, They need to be able to connect to each other. This thing, when we are, the other time that we talked about network, we said when two networks want to connect with each other, what do they use? You have network A want to connect to network B. They use router. It is the router that link both of them together. So when you create a VPC, or when you create a VPC comes with a router. So by default, all the subnets you create will use that router. But you can also create your own specific router. So you can also create your own specific router. And router is what helps the subnets to be able to communicate, what helps the resources in a subnet to be able to communicate to another resources in another subnet. This is done with the help of a router. So by default, when you create a VPC, as I said earlier, it comes with a router, and these two subnets, they use that router to communicate with each other. But if you want the people on the internet, to be able to communicate as well to the public subnet, though we name it public subnet, but it's still private, irrespective of the name. By default, it's private. So if you want to actually make it public, then we need to go and modify our route table. So the route table is a table that contains a set of rules called routes. So if traffic is coming from this internet, from this customer, then we have to provide an instruction that if a route or if traffic is coming from this route, this is where you should send it to. That place is called target. If a route is coming from our employee or our administrator, this is where you should send it to. If a traffic is coming from a corporate data center, which is a route, this is where you should send it to. So those instructions is what we need to provide in our route table. And that instruction is called route. The route is the rules that determine where traffic or network traffic from your subnet or gateway is directed. And when you create a route table, the route table or the route must be attached to the subnet. So by default, when you create a subnet, you don't create a router because AWS automatically create that. It's a managed service. But the only thing you need to create is your route table. So by default, when you create a route table, it comes with this destination and target. And you will see that it comes with local and this IP address, this CIDR block. Which simply means is that any IP address that falls within this range, it is local, meaning that it is within this VPC. So that means they can communicate freely because they are in the same VPC. So if I want, I can create a separate route. I can create a separate route table for my resources, and I will use one for the public subnet and one for the private subnet. And this is the best option because if you don't create a separate route table for each VPC, especially to differentiate between public subnet and private subnet, if you go and change this route and put a route that leads to the public, even if you name the VPC private, as long as you put a route that leads to the public, the private VPC is indirectly public. Then you have to do what is called a subnet association by associating a route table to a subnet or a subnet to a route table. So if the only thing that makes this subnet a public subnet, the only thing that makes this subnet, this one here, the only thing that makes it different from this subnet here, different from this, is the presence of the public IP address or public CIDR block in the subnet, in the route table that is attached to the subnet. Let me take a step back. What you are seeing on the screen now, between these two VPC, this VPC, I mean this subnet and this subnet, you see this subnet is public and this one is private. And they have their route table. Each one of them have their route table. Because of this route table you are seeing, they are the same. And this is the default settings for every route table. If you create any route table, this is the default settings. It comes with this IP. Whatever the IP of your VPC is what it will show here. If the IP of your VPC, I mean, if the CIDR block of your VPC is 173.2.1.0/12 or /26, this here is what you will see here. So when you create a route, it comes automatically with a route table. I mean, when you create a route table, it comes automatically with a route. And that route comes, and this is the route, the IP, the CIDR block of your VPC. So if you do not modify this route table and you attach it to a specific subnet, that subnet is private, even if the name you give to it is public subnet. But the only thing that makes it public is that if you go to that route table and you modify it and you put this IP there, or this CIDR block, if you put the CIDR block and the target is the IGW ID, the ID of the internet gateway, then it is until you put this is when the private subnet, or this is when this subnet becomes public. And this is the only time people on the internet can start accessing that subnet. If there is no this is private, no matter the name that you give to it. So if somebody asks you in an interview, what is the difference between a private subnet and a public subnet? This, what you are saying as they are different, is this: the presence of the internet route in the route table. That's the difference.